Welcome to IQriously. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. In a moment, we're going to explore something extraordinary together. Something that happened long ago. Something that shaped the entire world you live in. There's nothing you need to do. Nowhere you need to be. Just listen. The fall of the Roman Empire. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the city of Rome. Not Rome as it is today, but Rome at the height of its power. It is the year 100 AD, and what you see around you is almost impossible to describe. The city stretches out in every direction. Grand marble temples rise against a blue sky. Wide stone roads carry merchants, soldiers, and citizens through the noise and heat of the streets. Aqueducts carry clean water across the hills from miles away. Public baths, lit by fires, open to ordinary people every single day. Rome is home to over 1 million people. In a world where most settlements number in the hundreds, this is something almost beyond imagining. And it is not just Rome, the city. The Roman Empire stretches from the cold grey shores of Britain in the north, all the way down to the burning sands of North Africa in the south. Eastward, it reaches into what is now Syria, Turkey, and the edge of Mesopotamia. At its peak, the Roman Empire covers around 5 million square kilometers. It holds somewhere between 50 and 90 million people under its rule. For over 1,000 years, Rome has endured, has grown, has bent the world to its shape. And then, slowly, almost invisibly at first, it begins to come apart. To understand the fall, we need to understand what made Rome so extraordinary in the first place. Rome's greatness was built on several things. A brilliant military, a genius for administration, roads that connected every corner of the empire, laws that gave structure to daily life, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of shared identity, of being Roman, of belonging to something larger than yourself. The period historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted roughly from 27 BC to 180 AD. Over 200 years of relative stability, of expansion and prosperity. Emperors like Augustus, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius oversaw an empire that, for all its cruelty and inequality, functioned. People paid their taxes. Grain arrived in the cities. Legions held the borders. But even during these golden years, there were warning signs. One of the strangest was this. Rome was built on conquest, on taking wealth from other peoples and bringing it home. But conquest has limits. By the 2nd century AD, the empire had reached roughly its maximum size. There were no more easy victories, no more vast territories to absorb. The engine of expansion that had powered Rome's economy for centuries was running out of fuel. And running an empire, it turns out, is enormously expensive. Before we talk about the weight of running an empire, we need to talk about the army that held it together. Because the Roman legions were not just a military force. They were the skeleton of the empire itself, the thing that made everything else possible. At their peak, the legions were something extraordinary. Highly trained, professionally paid, disciplined to a degree that no other fighting force in the ancient world could match. A Roman legionary was not simply handed a sword and pointed at the enemy. He trained constantly. He could march 20 miles in 5 hours carrying 40 kilograms of equipment. He could build a fortified camp from scratch at the end of a full day's march. He could swim rivers in full armor. And crucially, he identified as Rumen, not as a member of a tribe or a village or a regional family, but as part of something vast and enduring. This sense of shared identity was one of Rome's greatest military advantages. But as the empire grew, and as the financial pressures mounted, something began to shift. Rome started recruiting soldiers from outside the empire, from the very peoples it had once fought. Germanic warriors, skilled and brave, but with no particular loyalty to Rome as an idea. They fought for pay, for land, for their commanders, not for the eagle standard, not for the eternal city. This process had a name. The Romans called it the Foederati Federated Troops, allies rather than citizens. And over time, the proportion of the army made up of Foederati grew and grew, until by the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman army was in many places barely Roman at all. Generals with names like Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer men of Germanic or mixed origin became the real power behind the imperial throne. Capable men, often, but men whose loyalty was personal and practical rather than civic and deeply rooted. When an empire's army stops believing in the empire, something fundamental has already been lost. The weapons were still there. The tactics were still there. But the shared belief that once animated it all that was quietly fading. Think about what it takes to maintain a territory the size of the Roman Empire. You need soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of them, stationed at distant frontiers, fed, paid, equipped, and kept loyal. You need roads and someone to maintain them. You need governors, administrators, tax collectors. You need grain shipments, water systems, courts of law. All of this costs money. Enormous sums of money. And as the easy wealth of conquest dried up, Rome began to face something it had never truly had to deal with before. A budget problem. The response, across many emperors and many decades, was to raise taxes. And to do something rather clever, or so it seemed at the time. They debased the currency. What this means is simple. A Roman silver coin, the denarius, was once made almost entirely of silver. Pure, valuable silver. But over time, emperors began adding other metals to the mix. Copper, lead, anything cheaper. By the 3rd century AD, some Roman coins contained less than 5% silver. And of course, the people noticed. If your money is worth less, prices go up. If prices go up, ordinary people suffer. If ordinary people suffer, they lose faith in the system that governs them. This is one of the quieter, slower ways that empires begin to die. Not with a dramatic battle, but with a coin that no longer quite rings true. But what did all of this actually feel like for ordinary people? History tends to focus on emperors and generals, on battles and treaties, on the great turning points that historians can point to and say that is where things changed. But most people did not live in the pages of history. They lived in towns and farms and workshops. They raised children and argued with neighbors and worried about the price of bread. So what was daily life like as the empire slowly declined? For much of the 3rd and 4th century, the honest answer is not dramatically different from before. The decline of Rome was so gradual, so drawn out over so many generations, that most people living through it would not have felt they were witnessing the end of an era. What they would have felt was a slow accumulation of difficulties, taxes rising, then rising again, the tax collectors becoming more aggressive, more desperate, a farmer who had always managed to get by finding that each year a little more of his harvest was taken, prices in the market going up faster than wages. The silver coin your grandfather remembered solid, reliable, worth something now lighter in the hand and duller in color. Trade routes that had once been safe and busy becoming less certain. Merchants taking different roads. Some goods becoming harder to find. And then there were the soldiers, or rather, the absence of them. In the frontier provinces, the edges of the empire, where the Rhine and Danube rivers marked the boundary between the Roman world and everything beyond, people had always lived in the shadow of military presence. Legionary forts, watchtowers, the reassuring sight of disciplined men in armor. As the 3rd and 4th centuries wore on, that reassurance thinned. Troops were pulled to fight civil wars elsewhere. Forts were left undermanned. The watchtowers on the river went dark, and the raids began. Not invasions at first, just raids. Quick, brutal incursions across the river. Cattle stolen, villages burned, people taken. For the people on the frontier, these raids were not history. They were life, terrifying, inescapable life. Some responded by moving further inside the empire. Abandoning the frontier farmsteads their families had worked for generations and heading south, towards the cities, towards whatever safety remained. Others stayed and tried to adapt. This is perhaps the most human thing about Rome's decline. It was not experienced as a grand narrative. It was experienced as a series of difficult, ordinary decisions. Do we stay, or do we go? Do we pay the tax collector, or hide the grain? Do we trust the soldiers at the gate, or bar it against them? Empires end, but people simply keep living, as best they can. If the economy was a slow leak, the crisis of the 3rd century was a hole torn open in the hull. Between 235 and 284 AD, just 50 years, Rome saw more than 50 emperors. Let that settle for a moment. 50 emperors in 50 years. Some lasted months. Some lasted weeks. At least 25 of them were assassinated. This was a period of almost total chaos. Civil wars erupted across the empire. Generals raised their own armies and declared themselves emperor. Other generals raised different armies to stop them. While Rome tore itself apart from within, enemies pressed in from the outside. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube rivers tested the borders. The Sassanid Persian Empire in the east grew more aggressive. And then there was something far older and far more terrifying than any army: disease. The Antonine Plague had arrived in the 2nd century, possibly brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Some historians believe it was smallpox. It killed millions. Then came the plague of Cyprian, beginning around 249 AD. At its height, this epidemic was reportedly killing 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. 5,000 people. Every day. The combination of political chaos, economic strain, and devastating disease weakened the empire to its foundations. It did not collapse. Rome was extraordinary in its resilience. But it emerged from this period changed. Smaller in some ways, harder, more desperate. By the end of the 3rd century, an emperor named Diocletian made a decision that he believed would save Rome. He divided it in two. The logic was sound. The empire was simply too large for one person to govern effectively. Too many borders to defend. Too many crises happening simultaneously in different places. So Diocletian created a Western empire, centered eventually on Rome and later on the city of Ravenna in northern Italy, and an Eastern empire centered on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople by the Emperor Constantine. And here is one of the great ironies of this story. The Eastern Empire thrived. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of trade routes between Europe and Asia. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more densely populated, more urbanized. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, would survive for another 1,000 years after the West fell. But the West was a different story. Poorer agricultural land. A longer, harder frontier to defend. Less trade. Less revenue. And a series of emperors who, with a few exceptions, were simply not equal to the scale of what they faced. No account of Rome's transformation would be complete without discussing the most profound cultural shift of the entire era: the rise of Christianity. In the 1st century AD, Christianity was a small, persecuted sect. Its followers were occasionally used as scapegoats. Some were thrown to lions in the arena. They worshipped in secret, in private homes, in the catacombs beneath the city. By the 4th century, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. How this happened is one of the most dramatic stories in all of history. The turning point came with the Emperor Constantine. In 312 AD, on the eve of a crucial battle for control of the empire, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, and the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether the vision was real, or a political calculation, or something in between, we cannot know. But the consequences were enormous. Constantine converted to Christianity. He issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance across the empire. He poured imperial resources into building great churches. He convened the Council of Nicaea to settle theological disputes and unify the faith. By the end of the 4th century, the Emperor Theodosius had made Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. The old gods Jupiter, Mars, Juno, the entire vast pantheon that had accompanied Rome since its earliest days, were officially abandoned. Now, historians debate fiercely about what effect this had on the empire's decline. Edward Gibbon, in his Great History, argued that Christianity weakened Rome, that it turned the Roman mind away from civic and military virtues, courage, discipline, the love of earthly glory, and towards humility, charity, and the hope of heaven. Other historians have pushed back hard against this view. They point out that the Eastern Roman Empire, deeply Christian, survived for another 1,000 years. That Christian Roman generals fought just as fiercely as their pagan predecessors. That the faith arguably gave the later empire a new source of shared identity to replace the old civic religion. The truth, as so often, is complicated. What we can say is this. The conversion of Rome to Christianity redirected enormous resources, money, energy, talent, stone from the old structures of civic and imperial life into the new structures of the church. Great temples were stripped of their treasures. The priesthoods of the old gods were disbanded. Centuries of accumulated religious tradition were deliberately dismantled. Whether this weakened Rome or simply changed, it changed it into something that would outlast the empire itself in the form of the medieval church is perhaps the most interesting question of all. What is certain is that the Rome which fell in 476 AD was a fundamentally different civilization from the Rome of Augustus. And Christianity was a large part of that transformation. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbaros, meaning someone who doesn't speak Greek, someone foreign, someone other. The Romans used it to describe the peoples beyond their borders, and for centuries, the legions had held those peoples back. But something was changing. Far to the east, on the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a people called the Huns had begun moving west. Exactly why is still debated by historians. Perhaps climate shifts made their traditional lands less habitable. Perhaps it was simply the restless movement of a nomadic warrior culture. But the Huns were extraordinary fighters. Fast, mounted, ferocious. And as they moved west, they pushed everything in their path ahead of them. The Germanic tribes who had long lived along Rome's northern borders, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals found themselves caught between the Huns behind them and the Roman Empire in front. In 376 AD, a great many Visigoths appeared on the banks of the Danube River. They asked to be allowed to cross into Roman territory, to settle, to seek safety. The Emperor Valens agreed. What happened next is one of the most consequential failures in Roman history. The Roman officials responsible for settling the Visigoths were corrupt. They exploited the desperate refugees. They forced starving people to trade their own children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. Dog meat. The Visigoths had asked for mercy. They had been given humiliation. They rose in rebellion. 2 years later, in 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople in what is now Turkey, the Visigoths met a Roman army in open battle. The Romans lost, catastrophically. Emperor Valens himself was killed on the field. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and it shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility. The gates were open, and they would never fully close again. For 800 years, the city of Rome had not been successfully invaded. 800 years. In all that time, through all the wars and crises and upheavals, the city itself had remained unbreached. It had become almost symbolic. Rome was eternal. Rome was invincible. Rome could not fall. Then came 410 AD. A Visigoth king named Alaric had long negotiated with the Roman court. He wanted land for his people. He wanted formal recognition. He wanted a role within the empire, not outside it. He was refused, repeatedly. So he marched on Rome. The city's walls were ancient and thick, but the empire that had once manned them was a shadow of what it had been. The Emperor Honorius had retreated to the safety of Ravenna. The people of Rome were left largely to themselves. On the 24th of August 410 AD, the gates of Rome opened. Some accounts suggest they were opened from within, by slaves, and the Visigoths poured in. For 3 days, they looted the city. They were not, by the standards of ancient warfare, particularly brutal. There was no mass killing. Churches were largely respected, but the symbolic shock was total. When the news spread across the empire, across the Mediterranean world, people could not believe it. St. Jerome, one of the most learned men of his age, wrote from his monastery in Bethlehem, "My voice sticks in my throat." The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The eternal city had fallen, and everyone knew, somewhere deep inside, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. After 410, the Western Empire did not suddenly collapse. It unraveled, slowly, piece by piece. Province by province, the territories of the West slipped away. Britain was abandoned by the legions around 410, simply because there were no soldiers to spare to defend it. The Romano-British population, who had lived under Roman rule for nearly 4 centuries, were told to look to their own defense. North Africa, one of the most vital grain-producing regions of the entire empire, fell to the Vandals in the 430s. With it went enormous amounts of tax revenue and food supply. Gaul, what is now France, gradually fell under the control of various Germanic kingdoms. Spain followed. And through all of this, the Western emperors grew weaker and more irrelevant. Power shifted to military strongmen, often of Germanic origin, who served as puppet masters behind the throne. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. This sacking was more thorough than Alaric's. The Vandals spent 2 weeks stripping the city of its treasures. And still the empire technically persisted. Until it didn't. His name was Romulus Augustulus. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that name. Romulus, the name of the legendary founder of Rome itself, the man who supposedly drew the first furrow in the ground and said, "Here is where my city will stand." Augustus, the title of the very first emperor, the great and brilliant Augustus, who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. The last Western emperor carried both these names. He was a teenager. His father, a general object named Orestes, had placed him on the throne in 475 AD, not because the boy had any great ability, but because a puppet emperor was useful. Less than a year later, a Germanic leader named Odoacer led a revolt. Orestes was killed. The boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was brought before the conqueror. And Odoacer, in an act that says something about how little the Western emperorship now meant, simply sent him into exile, to a castle in Campania, in the south of Italy. He was given a pension. He was allowed to live. Odoacer seemed almost sorry for him. On the 4th of September 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus stepped down from the throne of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the symbols of Roman authority to Constantinople. To the Eastern Emperor, there would be no more Western emperors. After more than 1,000 years, Rome was gone. Historians had been arguing about this question for over 200 years. In 1984, a German historian named Alexander de Mante compiled a list of all the reasons scholars had ever proposed for Rome's fall. He counted over 200 separate explanations. 200. Military failure, economic collapse, political corruption, climate change, plague, moral decay, the rise of Christianity, the reliance on foreign soldiers, overexpansion, lead poisoning from pipes and cookware, the loss of civic virtue. All of these have been proposed, some more seriously than others. The honest answer is that Rome fell for many reasons, and that these reasons were deeply entangled with each other. Plague weakened the population, which reduced tax revenue, which meant fewer soldiers could be paid, which left the borders less defended, which allowed more invasions, which caused more disruption, which caused Tau. More economic decline. One thing feeding into another. A slow cascade. What is fascinating, and what modern historians have increasingly emphasized, is the role of climate. During the height of Roman power, the Mediterranean climate was unusually warm and stable. Good for farming. Good for feeding large armies. Good for keeping a vast empire fed and functioning. From around 150 AD onwards, the climate began to shift. Slowly at first, then more dramatically. Droughts, cooler temperatures, reduced agricultural yields. The empire had been built on a foundation of good weather, and the weather changed. None of this excuses the corruption, the poor leadership, the economic mismanagement. But it does remind us that history is not simply about the decisions of great men and women. Sometimes, the world itself shifts beneath our feet. Here is something important to remember. The fall of Rome was not the end of the world. For the people who lived through it, it was often brutal and frightening. The loss of central authority meant the loss of trade networks, of legal protection, of the infrastructure that clean water and safe roads provided. But life continued. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman rule were not simply chaotic wastelands. Many of them admired Rome deeply. They kept Roman laws. They kept Latin as the language of government and religion. They married into Roman aristocratic families. The Catholic Church, which had grown enormously powerful in the final centuries of Roman rule, stepped into the vacuum of authority. Bishops became civic leaders. Monasteries became centers of learning and agriculture. Roman culture did not die. It transformed. The Latin language became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Roman law forms the basis of legal systems across Europe and beyond. Roman architecture inspired the great cathedrals of the medieval world. And in the East, Constantinople New Rome continued for nearly another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire carried the flame of Roman civilization all the way to 1453 AD, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. Rome did not so much end as dissolve. Its edges softened. Its structures were absorbed and repurposed by the world that grew up around its ruins. There is a reason the fall of Rome has fascinated people for centuries. It is not just that it is a great story, though it is. It is that it feels like a warning. Every generation that has read about Rome has seen something familiar in its decline. The political divisions, the corruption, the gap between rich and poor, the reliance on mercenaries, the loss of civic trust. Edward Gibbon, who wrote the great history of Rome's decline in the 18th century, was writing partly about his own time, as have historians in every century since. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson Rome offers us. Not that great things are doomed to fall, but that greatness requires constant tending, that institutions need care, that trust, once lost, is very hard to rebuild, and that even the most enduring things in human history, the things that seem permanent, immovable, eternal, are made of the same fragile stuff as everything else. Time, effort, belief. And so the Western Roman Empire, after 1,000 years of history of glory and cruelty, of brilliant engineering and savage warfare, of marble temples and muddy frontiers, came quietly to its end. Not with a single great catastrophe, but with a tired boy emperor packing his things and riding south into exile. With a Germanic king sending a crown he had no use for to a distant city. With the slow, quiet sound of one world ending and another beginning to stir. Thank you for spending this time with IQriously. If this episode has found you somewhere peaceful, somewhere warm and comfortable and almost asleep, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. Rest well. History will still be here tomorrow.